The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to Fostering Success Michigan's Network webinar series. Thank you for joining us. My name is Carrie Ward. I'm an MSW intern and graduate assistant here at Fostering Success Michigan. The FSM Network webinar series aims to provide students, supportive adults, and practitioners practical and pertinent information on how to best support youth with experience in foster care. I'd like to acknowledge our funders, the Kresge Foundation, the Have a Mill Foundation, and WMU for making this webinar possible. And I'd also like to remind you that resources, including a recording of this webinar, will be available on our website following the presentation today. Today's webinar, Human Trafficking, the Intersection Between Child Welfare and Modern-Day Slavery, by FSM Student Ambassador Brittany Barkowiak, will define human trafficking and discuss common characteristics of individuals who have been victimized. The connection between child welfare system and trafficking will be explored. Current legislation, local and national efforts will be discussed. Recommendations for professionals and local and national resources will be provided. Brittany Barkowiak graduated summa cum laude with her BSW from Eastern Michigan University and is a current MSW candidate at the University of Michigan. As Fostering Success Michigan Student Ambassador, Brittany is passionate about advocating for increased access to positive outcomes for students from foster care, both personally and professionally. She also has experience working with individuals who have been impacted by violence and facilitates a support group for survivors of sexual assault within her community. A recipient of Michigan Campus Compact's Heart and Soul Award and Casey Family Program's Foster Care to Success Outstanding Achievement Scholarship, Brittany's work has been featured on FSM's website, in Michigan Youth Opportunities Initiative newsletter, and on NPR's State of Opportunity. Brittany has led presentations and conducted workshops both nationally and statewide. Brittany will focus on management of youth and family services in graduate school and plans to graduate with her MSW in August of 2015. And I did want to mention that you may be familiar with Brittany's work via her blog, Brittany's blog on the Fostering Success Michigan website, and if not, I would definitely encourage you to visit as it's one of the very popular components of our website. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Brittany Barkowiak. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Carrie. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brittany Barkowiak. Thank you for joining me today to discuss human trafficking, the intersection between the child welfare system and modern-day slavery. I recognize that human trafficking isn't exactly a fun or uplifting topic to talk about, but it's an important one, especially for child welfare professionals and those providing services to young people. However, the vast majority of professionals have not received the training or resources they need to recognize human trafficking when it is occurring or to support those who have survived it. It's an emerging and ever-changing field, but one that individuals across professions are learning more about. This presentation today will barely skim the surface of all that human trafficking is, but I'm hoping it will help you identify ways to advocate for trafficking victims in your work. Before we get started, I want to briefly explain my use of the word victim when referring to individuals who have been trafficked. The word survivor is typically the preferred term when discussing individuals who have endured instances of violence or trauma. However, to say survivor implies that they are no longer being victimized. I would like to be inclusive of both current victims and survivors of trafficking throughout the presentation, and therefore I feel the term victim is most appropriate. In the event that you encounter someone involved in human trafficking, the best thing to do is to ask how they identify if it is necessary to distinguish between victims and survivors. It's my hope that by the end of this webinar, you will be able to identify a suspected case of modern slavery and know what to do about it. I'll discuss why foster care has sometimes been called a pipeline for human trafficking, and the ways in which the child welfare system and slavery connect. This webinar is intended for all child welfare professionals and supportive adults of young people in and from foster care. But this is an issue that all human beings should care about. Which brings us to our next slide with a quote from the President. which states that everyone should be concerned about the injustice and outrage that is human trafficking, and that it should be called by its true name, modern slavery. There are two types of modern slavery, sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Instead of simply reading the definitions, I'd like to provide you with examples that illustrate what human trafficking can actually look like. I'm going to briefly tell you about a domestic minor sex trafficking victim who we will call Kate. This all happened in real life, by the way. Kate's 17 and from Ohio. Law enforcement said she was from a broken home and began dating an amazing older guy who just showered her with love and affection. They moved in together and everything was perfect until Kate's boyfriend could no longer afford rent, and he asked her to start going on some dates with other men to do her part to help with bills. Kate says she didn't want to, but she trusted him and finally agreed to go on dates and engage in sexual acts. This continued for quite a while, undoubtedly leaving emotional and probably physical scars before Kate came into contact with a nurse who recognized the symptoms and reported her suspicion. An example of labor trafficking, on the other hand, that happened in the U.S. was about a man who pretended to be the guardian of 3 kids. He changed their names, gave them new birthdays, and took them to school every day to provide a sense of normalcy. But behind the scenes, he was forcing them to clean houses and perform household chores that far exceeded what is typically expected of children. There was also physical abuse and neglect involved. Though school authorities called Child Protective Services many times, no one recognized the situation as human trafficking until much later. The children have since been rescued and placed in foster care. Human trafficking varies greatly from case to case, but those are just 2 examples that illustrate the definitions. So how do you know if a situation is human trafficking or not? Good question. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 introduced the Action, Means, and Purpose, or AMP model. For a situation to be legally considered an instance of human trafficking, it must contain one aspect from each category. In the case of child sex trafficking, however, the model looks a little bit different. Force, fraud, and coercion are not required for minors induced into commercial sex acts. It's illegal simply because of their age. But I believe that this model can actually be helpful when thinking of child victims of labor trafficking as well. For children in general, the force and coercion tactics may not be overt and may be much more difficult to recognize. The top child trafficking industries in the United States are pimp-controlled prostitution, peddling rings, and pornography. Peddling rings, number 2, refers to the act of soliciting money or selling material items, magazine subscriptions, or drugs. Children are often kept behind the scenes in labor trafficking industries, such as in hotels or the food service industry, and many are forced to lie about their age in sex trafficking-related acts. Unfortunately, human trafficking happens a lot. It's estimated that 27 million people are being trafficked worldwide, and at least 100,000 children are victims of sex trafficking in the United States. Young people ages 11 through 14 are most vulnerable, and their chance of being trafficked spikes when they become homeless. One of the most difficult parts about human trafficking being an emerging field is that it's so difficult to know how prevalent trafficking is, or how many victims there actually are. It often goes unreported and unrecognized, and until recently, in recent years, there has been overall little attention paid to it. But as you can see, even the estimated figures, which may vary from source to source, indicate that it's a serious problem. To quote Christine Kalpin from Casey Family Programs, we recognize that while limited data exists, the data we have are so very concerning. One of the most common myths with human trafficking is that it doesn't happen in the United States, or that it only involves international victims. But as you can see, this isn't true. This map reflects the location of potential human trafficking cases reported to the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline between 2007 and 2012. The red areas indicate a large amount of suspected trafficking. As you may notice, some of the very concentrated areas are popular tourism spots in the U.S., such as Florida, Hawaii, the East Coast, and California. This could be because of the large number of hotels, resorts, escort services, prostitution, and restaurants in those areas. The Midwest also appears as a concentrated area, which is primarily due to the intersection of major highways and prevalence of highway routes in that region. Just a reminder that these are only the reported suspected cases of trafficking. Much of human trafficking that occurs goes on unreported. Taking a closer look at Michigan, you'll notice the most concentrated areas are along border crossings and large cities. In terms of connecting these figures to child welfare, keep in mind that larger cities tend to have larger foster care populations, as well as more folks who are homeless. Homelessness and foster care can both be risk factors for trafficking. As you can see, modern slavery is clearly a widespread problem. So what's being done about it? An exciting law was passed earlier this year, the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act. For those of you who may be familiar with the law, you've probably noticed how multifaceted it is. The legislation now requires foster care and adoption agencies, such as the Department of Human Services, for example, to develop a plan to recognize and report suspected instances of human trafficking. The legislation also includes new measures for runaway youth and promotes this concept of normalcy for young people in foster care. The reason why this is so important is because youth who are more connected to their community and are involved in age-appropriate activities are less likely to become victimized by traffickers. Additional pending legislation includes a bill that would provide $25 million of annual funding to increase awareness and resources for human trafficking victims. The next piece of pending legislation mandates that all states treat minors engaged in commercial sex acts as victims instead of criminals, and supports placing those victims in child protective services. Individuals involved in human trafficking are often arrested for prostitution when they should be treated as the victim of a human trafficking crime instead of an offender. Also, as it currently stands, victims of human trafficking are often placed in the juvenile justice system or in the foster care system. There's no official system for how human trafficking victims should be taken care of. One viewpoint might argue that placing trafficking victims in either juvenile justice or foster care systems isn't actually the best place for them. Doing so can deplete those systems of valuable resources, which are already pretty scarce. Until a formal process or system is established, though, it's important that practitioners working within the existing framework can recognize when human trafficking is going on, or when a client has experienced it. Chances are you're already working or have worked with human trafficking victims. But recognizing victims can be really difficult, especially when they may not even realize it themselves. On this slide, we have common characteristics of individuals who have been trafficked and some things to be aware of and watch out for in your work. These are not qualifications for trafficking, but they are observable trends within that population. There's also a handout which corresponds to this webinar with this list on it if you'd like to refer back to it. I want to be sure to point out that trafficking victims may look like any other youth you encounter in your work, and you may come in contact with them through other means, such as substance abuse, truancy, prostitution, etc. I've heard that child welfare professionals often recognize that something isn't quite right in a case they encounter that involves human trafficking, but they can't always make sense of what's actually going on. Being aware of the commonalities between victims and being aware of human trafficking as a whole can help make sense of trafficking cases and could even help save a kid's life. Misidentification of human trafficking is the primary barrier to intervention and access to services for trafficked youth, according to the Casey Family Programs. To launch the discussion about foster care being a pipeline for human trafficking, let's take a moment to watch this awareness video produced by MTV. I'd like to give you a heads up that there are aspects of this short film that are disturbing and portray men in implied sexual situations with a perceived minor. It might be triggering.
My father abused me. I've lived in 4 different foster homes. I don't even know how many men I've been with. I've been doing this since I was 14. And I'm tired. I don't like this. Is this all I'm good for? Do you even care who I am?
Just relax.
And we're back. What really sticks with me when I watch this is the diminished sense of self-worth and the apparent lack of agency and stability that girl describes with her brief description of her time in foster care and as a trafficking victim. The emotional and situational themes of foster care and human trafficking can actually mirror one another and feel like really similar experiences for victims. This is one way that human trafficking and child welfare connect. The emotional implications of being in foster care can create a near-perfect environment for traffickers that prey on that vulnerability, that prey on the question of self-worth and the lack of expectation to live a stable and safe life. The numbers definitely show a correlation. Keep in mind that collecting extensive or holistic data on trafficking is very difficult, but these examples show that trafficking victims often have previous experience having been in foster care or may end up in foster care as a result of being trafficked. You'll notice in 2012, 50 to 80% of California minor sex trafficking victims were in foster care previously. That's an obscenely high number, and we're seeing those trends in recent years too throughout the U.S. There are a number of different risk factors that increases a young person's likelihood of being trafficked. There are also several shared risk factors that I was able to identify between human trafficking and foster care, such as homelessness, scarcity of resources, living a transient lifestyle, an overall rejection of systems, and an increased desire for belonging and connection. It could even be argued that the foster care system conditions young people to the norms of trafficking, as is demonstrated in this insightful quote from Withelma Pettigrew, a survivor of both sex trafficking and the foster care system. She points out that kids in care are used to being objectified, even by people who are supposed to care for them. Young people in foster care hardly ever feel like they have much control over their own life, and they're not often given the opportunity to build meaningful relationships and attachments. Ms. Pettigrew says in her quote that the most consistent relationship she ever had in care was with her pimp and his family. The emotional impact and damage done by traffickers is one of the most complex aspects of human trafficking. Traffickers can use a diverse array of tactics to coerce victims into completing specific sexual acts or labors. Similar to intimate partner violence, which has a power and control wheel very similar to this one, traffickers can use a range of methods to control victims. These methods include outright physical violence, intimidation, emotional or psychological abuse, sexual abuse, forced drug dependence, and abuse of privileges, to name only a few. The power and control wheel presented on this slide can be useful for anyone who might be working with someone they suspect might be involved in a trafficking situation. With survivors of domestic violence, for example, many practitioners look at this wheel with their client and ask if the examples listed sound familiar or resonate with their situation. Another aspect that can often make assisting survivors of trafficking difficult is the idea of the perfect victim. Often, service providers and general members of society expect survivors of trafficking to be meek, thankful, and passive recipients who are simply looking to escape or be rescued from their situation. The media often perpetuates these stereotypes with their depictions of human trafficking in movies and on TV. But the reality is often much more complex. Survivors may not view their situation as human trafficking at all, and they may also not want to leave their traffickers for the numerous reasons we saw on the wheel in the most recent slide. They may not self-identify for a lot of reasons, such as shame, stigma, fear of arrest, or fear of violence or retaliation from their trafficker. Survivors may have experienced a lot of trauma, too, in their past, and they may have had a lot of negative experiences with previous service providers. As a result, they may distrust systems and want to limit their exposure to child welfare services and to law enforcement, as well as nonprofit agencies. These are all important factors to keep in mind. If you suspect someone may be experiencing trafficking, there are a number of different questions you can ask someone to get a better understanding of their situation. Traffickers keep their victims by maintaining power and control over them. When working with potential victims, it can be helpful to ask questions that require them to demonstrate awareness and agency within their daily lives. Questions such as, how do you get home every day? It is common for traffickers to have victims memorize a street address, but chances are the victim hasn't had the opportunity to become familiar with their community and may not even be allowed to look out the window when coming and going. Asking open-ended questions lets the suspected potential victim lead the conversation and disclose more information, or information that might clue you in that something not quite right is going on, which could be human trafficking. A common question service providers and advocates often ask themselves after being confronted with the reality of human trafficking is, what can I do? This issue is so large, so traumatic, and so complex. What can I do to instigate change? It's a great question. One of the best things you can do is to educate yourself about what trafficking actually is and what it looks like, and furthermore, how you can support survivors. Start thinking about what a survivor of human trafficking, what kind of trauma they've experienced. Share what you learn with other members of your agency so that they can bring increased awareness to their daily interactions with clients or people they work with. Consider maybe cataloging the different resources available to trafficking survivors so that you could easily provide them or reference them in your work. And always work to increase the agency and ability of survivors. Individuals who have experienced trafficking so often have very little control and agency, and when they do, it's often stripped away from their lives. It's really important that we as service providers support them in reclaiming those areas of their lives, if need be. It's essential to recognize the link that exists between human trafficking and the foster care system. One of the biggest barriers for the proper implementation of services for human trafficking victims is the lack of collaboration and awareness between systems. As we previously discussed, These individuals are often either sent to the child welfare system or often come from the child welfare system. However, there seems to be very little communication between those working in child welfare and those involved in anti-slavery efforts. Opening up those lines of communication and beginning partnerships between the two movements has such an immense chance for collaboration and service delivery that could be extremely beneficial in identifying and reaching victims of human trafficking. In addition to the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, there are a number of different national and local resources service providers can utilize to support survivors of trafficking. The Polaris Project, for example, is one of the largest national organizations dedicated to combating trafficking and supporting survivors. The Polaris Project compiles useful statistics, makes suggestions for public policies, and provides lists of different resources survivors may find useful. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Blue Campaign provides trainings and materials to service providers about trafficking within the U.S., while the Child Welfare Information Gateway provides a glossary of terms that can be useful for service providers. Catalog, they actually have little printout cards that you could even keep on your desk that have a list of different symptoms of human trafficking and also useful phone numbers and resources. Having even simply a little list on your desk or a little note to remember to screen for trafficking in the individuals that you work with, it could make a huge difference. There are also a number of different local resources that you can use to support survivors of trafficking, a sample of which are shown on this slide. A more complete list can be found by visiting the Michigan Human Trafficking Task Force's website. But always feel free to ask different organizations in your area what services they offer to support human trafficking victims, especially because of the emerging nature of this field and the emerging need to support survivors of trafficking. Oftentimes organizations need to find their own way and make their own path in navigating service delivery for this population. Having conversations with them about what services they might be able to provide or existing services that they might already have that you may not be aware of could increase your knowledge of the services available in your area in the case that you someday encounter a situation that you think might be human trafficking in your work. This concludes my presentation on the ways human trafficking and foster care intersect. Thank you very much for tuning in.
So Brittany, thank you. What a powerful presentation. You compiled lots of information and there was lots to digest. We do have some questions.
Great.
So the first one is, what age is someone most susceptible to sex trafficking?
Well, one of the biggest indicators for somebody being involved in sex trafficking is homelessness or being separated from their home. Specifically, runaway youth or youth with truancy issues often encounter sex trafficking more frequently than their peers who are not homeless. The average age for an individual to be involved in sex trafficking is around age 13, but more broadly between the ages of 11 and 14, which I don't know about you, but I find that to be really, really young.
Yes, yes. Okay, the next question. In the map of trafficking in Michigan, why were there fewer cases in the UP?
Sure, and again, the map does correspond to reported cases, so just because cases were not shown on the map does not mean that they do not exist, and there are several limitations and barriers to providing services and awareness in more rural areas, such as the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Chances are that there are several cases in the Upper Peninsula, but they weren't identified or the appropriate services weren't available in those areas. So that would be the reason for the fewer number of cases depicted in that area, but that the depiction doesn't actually display the reality. The reality of the situation is that human trafficking does occur in rural situations just as it does in urban populations, but unfortunately it often goes more undetected in rural places such as the Upper Peninsula.
Okay. And then one last question. It says, what does human trafficking have to do with campus-based support programs?
Sure. Well, campus-based support programs often, they support the population of students who have been through foster care. And as hopefully you learned from the webinar today, there are many individuals who are either placed in foster care or who grew up in foster care who fall victim to human trafficking. So chances are campus-based support programs across the state and across the nation who seek to serve people who have experienced foster care, chances are they will encounter at some point a student who has been in a situation where human trafficking has occurred. And just because a student may not have actually been a victim of human trafficking themselves, sometimes they could be the daughter of a trafficker, or they could have somehow been involved in a human trafficking ring per se, even if they weren't actually victim to what was happening. So it's important for campus-based support programs to be aware of the realities of human trafficking and the frequencies, and then also the resources that they can utilize to support survivors of human trafficking in the event that one of their students has been through trafficking.
Okay. Well, I want to say thank you so much for your work on this. You gave us lots of comprehensive information, and I want to also say that all of the documents and including a PDF of the webinar will be available following the webinar, so that you can access the various links and websites that Brittany's provided. So thank you again, Brittany, for coming today and sharing with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
And for the audience, thank you for participating in Fostering Success Michigan's Network webinar series. If you have ideas for this series or are interested in presenting a webinar, please contact Maddie Day, Director of Outreach and Training, via the email shown on your screen. Recordings of past webinars are available on the FSM website at www.fosteringsuccessmichigan.com. We have an upcoming webinar on February 17th as part of this webinar series. Elizabeth Bowker, Michigan licensed attorney from the Student Advocacy Center, will present on what middle school and high school counselors and educators need to know about youth with foster care experience. Thank you again for joining us today.